My name is Isabella Rodriguez, I'm 31 years old, and the night my sister Carmen looked at my dress blues across our family's Thanksgiving table and sneered, "Still playing soldier in that ridiculous costume, Izzy? When are you going to get a real job like the rest of us?" was the night everything changed. Not because of what she said, I'd heard variations of that insult for years, but because of what happened next. Her husband Derek, who had been cutting his turkey in comfortable silence, suddenly stopped mid-bite. His fork clattered against his plate. His face went completely white as he stared at the insignia on my uniform. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Wait, you're Colonel Rodriguez? The Colonel Rodriguez? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." The entire dining room went silent. You could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the corner, the soft hum of the refrigerator, even the distant sound of children playing in the backyard. Carmen's smug expression faltered as she looked between her husband's stunned face and my calm smile. "What are you talking about, Derek?" she asked, confusion creeping into her voice. "It's just Izzy. She's been in the military for like forever, but she's not. I mean, she's not important or anything." But Derek wasn't listening to his wife anymore. He was staring at me with something between awe and disbelief, his hands actually trembling as he set down his silverware. "You led the rescue operation in Afghanistan," he said, his voice growing stronger. "Operation Desert Dawn. My entire unit studied your tactical approach at Fort Braxton. You saved 47 hostages and brought every single soldier home alive." He turned to Carmen, whose mouth was now hanging slightly open. "Your sister isn't just any colonel, Carmen. She's the youngest woman in U.S. military history to receive the Distinguished Service Cross. She's a legend." I watched the color drain from Carmen's face as the weight of Derek's words settled over the table. Our parents, who had been quietly observing from the other end, exchanged glances that spoke volumes. They had always known what I did, but Carmen had never bothered to ask for details. She was too busy being embarrassed by what she saw as my phase that had lasted over a decade. Too busy introducing me to her country club friends as my sister who's still figuring things out, while she flaunted her real estate success and Derek's corporate achievements. See, this moment didn't happen in isolation. It was the culmination of years of family dynamics that had shaped both of our lives in completely different directions. Carmen had always been the golden child, homecoming queen, sorority president, married to a successful finance executive by 25. She lived in a sprawling house in Maplewood Heights, drove a luxury SUV, and treated our family gatherings like opportunities to showcase her picture-perfect life. Meanwhile, I had chosen a path that took me away from home for months at a time, to places my family couldn't pronounce, doing things I couldn't always discuss over dinner conversation. For years, Carmen had made subtle and not-so-subtle comments about my career choice. "When are you going to settle down and start a real life?" became her favorite question. She'd roll her eyes when I'd arrive at family functions in uniform, muttering comments about how I was showing off or making everything about myself. She never asked about my deployments, my commendations, or what I actually did in those far-off places. To her, I was just her little sister who had never grown up, who was too stubborn to admit that playing dress-up in a military uniform wasn't a sustainable career for a woman pushing 30. What Carmen didn't know, what she had never bothered to learn, was that while she was climbing the social ladder in our hometown of Riverside Valley, I was earning my stripes in some of the most challenging environments on earth. While she was planning charity galas and book club meetings, I was leading missions that made international headlines, though my name was often classified in the reports. While she was judging my costume, I was wearing a uniform that represented years of sacrifice, training, and service that had earned me the respect of commanding officers across multiple continents. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The irony of that Thanksgiving moment wasn't lost on me. Here was Derek, a man who had served himself before transitioning to civilian life, recognizing in an instant what my own sister had refused to see for over a decade. He understood the weight of the ribbons on my chest, the significance of the eagles on my shoulders, the meaning behind every carefully placed element of my dress uniform. He saw a decorated war hero where Carmen saw an embarrassing family member who couldn't get her life together. But this story isn't just about that single moment of revelation at a turkey dinner in suburban Minnesota. It's about the journey that led me to that table, wearing those dress blues with quiet pride while my sister prepared to humiliate me one more time. It's about growing up in the shadow of someone who measured success by house square footage and social media followers, while I measured it by lives saved and missions completed. It's about the years of small cutting remarks, the subtle undermining, the way family dynamics can shape us in ways we don't even realize until we're sitting across from someone who finally sees our true worth. Because before that moment when Derek's recognition changed everything, I had been questioning myself. Wondering if Carmen was right. Wondering if I had wasted my life pursuing something that my own family couldn't understand or respect. But sometimes, validation comes from the most unexpected sources, and sometimes it takes a stranger's respect to remind you of your own value. This is the story of how one dinner conversation revealed not just who I really was, but who my sister had always been. And how respect, once lost, can never truly be recovered. But before I tell you about Derek's stunned recognition and Carmen's complete humiliation at that Thanksgiving table, let me take you back to where this all really began. Because moments like these don't just happen out of nowhere. They're built on years of accumulated resentment, misunderstanding, and sibling rivalry that runs so deep it becomes part of your DNA. You don't wake up one day and decide to embarrass your military sister at a family dinner. You practice for it, unconsciously, through 1,000 small cruelties disguised as sisterly concern. This story isn't really about one shocking revelation over turkey and stuffing in Riverside Valley, Minnesota. It's about two sisters who took completely different paths in life and somehow ended up sitting across from each other as virtual strangers, each convinced the other had made the wrong choices. It's about how success can be measured in so many different ways that family members can look at the same person and see either a failure or a hero, depending on their own values and insecurities. See, transformative moments like the one that happened that November evening don't just explode into existence like fireworks. They simmer quietly beneath the surface of family barbecues and Christmas mornings and birthday celebrations, hidden under polite smiles and, "How's work going?" conversations that never quite scratch below the surface. They build slowly through years of assumptions, judgments, and the kind of casual dismissal that can only happen between people who've known each other their entire lives. Most people think dramatic family confrontations happen because someone finally snaps and starts screaming. But the truth is, the most devastating family moments happen in complete silence. They happen when someone's entire worldview gets shattered by a simple statement of fact. They happen when years of superiority and condescension get exposed as ignorance in front of an audience. They happen when the family member you've been quietly mocking turns out to be someone the world respects in ways you never imagined possible. Growing up, Carmen and I weren't enemies. We weren't even rivals, really. We were just different. She was 3 years older, which at the time felt like an entire generation of difference. She was everything our small town valued: popular, pretty, conventional in all the right ways. She dated the quarterback, got elected to student council, and had her entire life mapped out by the time she was 16. College at State University, marriage to someone successful, 2.5 kids in a suburb, and a career that looked impressive at high school reunions. Meanwhile, I was the kid reading military history books while other girls were reading teen magazines. I was the one asking our grandfather about his World War II service while Carmen complained about how his stories were boring and repetitive. I was fascinated by strategy, by leadership, by the idea that there were people out there dedicating their lives to something bigger than themselves. But in a town like Riverside Valley, where success was measured by how quickly you could escape to somewhere more exciting, my interests seemed quaint at best, concerning at worst. Our parents, God bless them, tried their best to support both of their daughters' dreams. Dad had served briefly in the National Guard, so he understood my attraction to military service, even if he worried about the dangers. Mom had always been proud of Carmen's social skills and academic achievements, but she also recognized that my path was going to be different from the beginning. They walked the delicate line that parents of very different children always walk, trying to celebrate each daughter's strengths without making the other feel diminished. But Carmen never quite got that memo. From the moment I announced my intention to attend West Point Military Academy instead of following her to State University, she made it clear that she thought I was making a mistake. "You're too smart for the military, Izzy," she'd say, as if intelligence and military service were mutually exclusive. "You could do anything you want. Why would you want to spend your life taking orders from other people?" What she never understood was that military service isn't about taking orders, it's about earning the right to give them. It's about proving yourself capable of making life and death decisions under pressure. It's about leadership, strategy, and the kind of responsibility that keeps you awake at night because other people's lives depend on the choices you make. But Carmen saw only the uniform, the rules, the apparent lack of freedom, and decided it wasn't a real career so much as an extended form of teenage rebellion. As the years passed and our lives diverged even further, our family gatherings became exercises in polite tolerance. Carmen would update everyone on her real estate transactions, her husband's latest promotion, their vacation plans, and their children's achievements. When it was my turn to share, I'd mention being stationed somewhere new, maybe a commendation I'd received, or a mission I'd completed, though I always had to be vague about the details. Military service doesn't translate well to dinner conversation, especially when half the people at the table don't really understand what you do all day. Carmen's subtle digs became more frequent over time. Comments about how I was still playing soldier, or questions about when I was going to get serious about my future, became standard parts of our interactions. She'd introduce me to her friends as my sister who's in the military, with the same tone other people used to say, my sister who's still figuring things out. It was death by 1,000 small cuts, each comment individually minor but collectively devastating to someone who was actually accomplishing extraordinary things in her professional life. The tragedy of it all was that Carmen wasn't a bad person. She wasn't intentionally malicious. She was just operating from a worldview so narrow that she couldn't see past her own definition of success. In her mind, achievement meant visible wealth, social status, and the kind of conventional markers that impress people at cocktail parties. Military service, with its modest pay and frequent relocations and inability to brag about classified accomplishments, simply didn't register as success in her framework. But stories like this don't end with years of quiet resentment and misunderstanding. They end with moments of truth that change everything. They end with revelations that force people to confront their own assumptions and biases. They end with the kind of dramatic irony that makes you realize how little you really know about the people closest to you. Because that Thanksgiving dinner was coming, and Derek was going to be there, and my dress blues were going to tell a story that Carmen had never bothered to learn. The stage was already set for a moment that would change our family dynamics forever, even though none of us saw it coming. Growing up in Riverside Valley was like living in a snow globe. Everything looked perfect from the outside, but the world inside was small, predictable, and impossible to escape without someone shaking everything up. Our house on Maple Street was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's business, where high school football games were the social event of the week, and where success was measured by how quickly you could graduate, get married, and buy a house 3 streets over from where you grew up. Carmen thrived in that environment like a flower in perfect soil. She was born for small-town royalty, with the kind of natural charisma that made teachers remember her name years after graduation and made other parents use her as an example when lecturing their own children about applying themselves. At 17, she was homecoming queen, student council president, and dating Marcus Thompson, whose family owned the largest car dealership in 3 counties. She had that effortless confidence that comes from never having to question whether you belong, because everywhere you go, people light up when they see you coming. I, on the other hand, was the kid who spent Saturday afternoons at the public library reading biographies of military leaders while other kids were at the mall. I devoured stories about Harriet Tubman's strategic brilliance during the Underground Railroad, studied Golda Meir's leadership during wartime, and memorized every detail I could find about the women who had quietly shaped military history from behind the scenes. Mrs. Patterson, our librarian, used to save new arrivals in the military history section specifically for me, knowing I'd burn through them in a weekend. Our grandfather, Papa Miguel, was my biggest influence during those formative years. He'd served in Vietnam as a communications specialist and had stories that could hold my attention for hours. While Carmen would roll her eyes and find excuses to leave the room whenever he started talking about his service, I hung on every word. He described the weight of responsibility he felt when transmitting critical information between units, the split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death, and the profound bond that forms between people who trust each other with their lives. Mija, he'd tell me in his quiet, thoughtful way, some people are born to build comfortable lives for themselves. Others are born to build something bigger than themselves. Neither path is wrong, but you have to know which one calls to you. He never directly encouraged me to join the military, but he planted seeds of understanding about service, sacrifice, and the kind of leadership that doesn't seek recognition. Carmen's path seemed predetermined from birth. She was going to attend state university like our parents had, major in something practical like business or communications, join a good sorority, graduate with honors, and marry someone from a nice family who could provide the kind of life our town respected. She followed that script perfectly, meeting Derek during her junior year when he was completing his MBA. He was handsome, ambitious, and came from a military family himself, though he'd chosen to pursue finance after completing his mandatory service commitment. Their courtship was like something out of a romantic comedy, dinner dates at the nicest restaurant in town, weekend trips to the state capital, long conversations about their shared goals and values. Carmen loved that Derek had served in the military because it gave him a certain gravitas that impressed her friends, but she was equally relieved that he'd moved on to what she considered a more serious career in the civilian world. He represented the perfect combination of respectability and ambition that our community valued. Meanwhile, my own interests were becoming more focused and, frankly, more concerning to my family. While Carmen was planning her post-graduation wedding, I was researching military academies and reading everything I could find about women in combat roles. I spent my senior year of high school preparing for the physical and academic challenges of military academy applications, running miles before dawn and staying up late studying advanced mathematics and science. The dinner conversation where I announced my acceptance to West Point was one of those family moments that gets seared into everyone's memory for different reasons. Carmen was showing off her engagement ring and talking about wedding venue options when I cleared my throat and said, "I have some news too. I got into West Point. I'm going to be a soldier." The silence that followed was deafening. Dad's face showed a mixture of pride and concern, pride for my achievement, concern for my safety. Mom immediately started asking practical questions about how often I'd be able to come home and whether the academy had proper support systems for young women. But Carmen's reaction was pure disbelief, as if I'd announced my intention to join the circus. "You're not serious," she said, laughing in that way people do when they think someone is playing an elaborate joke. "West Point is for people who want to be career soldiers. You're smart enough to do anything you want, Izzy. Why would you want to spend 4 years taking orders and marching around in ugly uniforms?" I tried to explain about leadership development, about the opportunity to serve something bigger than myself, about the academic rigor and the chance to work with some of the brightest minds in the country. But Carmen couldn't hear any of it over her own assumptions about what military service meant. In her worldview, smart people didn't choose the military, they chose careers that led to corner offices and country club memberships. Derek, interestingly, was quiet during that conversation. He understood better than anyone at the table what West Point represented, having gone through officer candidate school himself. But he was new to the family and still trying to navigate the dynamics between two very different sisters. He congratulated me sincerely but didn't push back against Carmen's obvious disapproval. Our parents did their best to support both of their daughters, but the tension was obvious. Carmen couldn't understand why I would choose a path that seemed so limiting when I had other options, while I couldn't understand why she thought service to country was somehow less valuable than service to corporate profits. We were speaking different languages even when we used the same words. The 4 years I spent at West Point only widened the gap between us. While Carmen was building her real estate career and planning her dream wedding, I was learning advanced military strategy, completing survival training, and developing the kind of leadership skills that would soon be tested in real-world situations. Every time I came home on leave, the differences between our worlds became more apparent. Carmen would ask polite questions about my studies, but it was clear she still saw my military education as a temporary phase that I'd eventually outgrow. She'd make comments about how I could use my leadership skills in the real world once I finished my commitment, not understanding that what I was doing was the real world. It was just a part of the real world that her comfortable suburban existence had never exposed her to. By the time I graduated as a second lieutenant, Carmen was already married and establishing herself as one of Riverside Valley's most successful young real estate agents. She had the house, the husband, the lifestyle that our community celebrated. And I had a uniform, a commission, and orders that would take me thousands of miles away from everything familiar. Neither of us could have predicted then how our diverging paths would eventually lead us back to that Thanksgiving table, where years of misunderstanding would finally collide with undeniable truth. The first signs that Carmen fundamentally misunderstood my career choice emerged during my initial deployment to Fort Henderson in Colorado. I was 22, fresh out of West Point, and excited to begin what I knew would be challenging but rewarding work as a logistics coordinator for a rapidly deployable unit. For me, this assignment represented everything I'd trained for: real responsibility, meaningful work, and the chance to prove myself in an environment where competence mattered more than connections. But when I called home to share the news about my posting, Carmen's reaction was telling. "Colorado," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of sympathy reserved for people who've received disappointing news. "That's so far from home, Izzy. And what exactly will you be doing there? Filing paperwork and organizing supplies?" She made logistics sound like an administrative job at a small-town insurance office, completely missing the strategic importance of ensuring that combat units had everything they needed, exactly when and where they needed it. I tried to explain that military logistics was actually an incredibly complex field, requiring split-second decision-making and coordination between multiple agencies under high-pressure conditions. That getting the right equipment to the right place at the right time could literally mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. But Carmen had already mentally categorized my work as not a real job and couldn't hear past her own preconceptions. Her comments during family phone calls became a constant source of low-level irritation. When I mentioned working late to coordinate a complex training exercise involving 3 different military branches, she'd respond with things like, "Well, I guess someone has to do those kinds of jobs." When I described the satisfaction of successfully managing a logistics nightmare that involved getting emergency medical supplies to a remote training facility during a blizzard, she'd changed the subject to her latest real estate sale, as if her commission on a suburban house somehow trumped my role in potentially saving lives. The pattern became more pronounced during holiday visits home. Carmen had married Derek the year after my graduation, and their wedding was everything our small town considered perfect: elegant venue, beautiful flowers, reception at the country club, honeymoon in Europe. I was able to attend on leave, wearing my dress blues as she'd requested, but even that became a source of subtle tension. Several guests commented on how nice I looked in uniform, but Carmen introduced me to everyone as my sister who's in the military right now, emphasizing the right now, as if my commission was a temporary summer job I'd eventually outgrow. Derek, I noticed, was different. He'd completed his own military service before business school, though he'd served in a different branch and never talked much about his experiences. When people asked him about his time in the service, he'd give brief, respectful answers and then redirect the conversation. I appreciated his discretion. Many veterans prefer not to discuss their service in social settings, but I also noticed how carefully he listened whenever I mentioned my work. Unlike Carmen, he seemed to understand that military service involved real responsibilities and real consequences. The disconnection became more painful during my second assignment, when I was promoted to first lieutenant and transferred to an overseas posting that I couldn't discuss in detail. Carmen's response to this news was predictably frustrating. "So now they're sending you even further away. What's the point of all this moving around, Izzy? How are you supposed to build a real life if you're never in one place long enough to put down roots?" She couldn't understand that for military personnel, especially those in specialized fields, frequent relocations were part of professional development. Each new assignment brought different challenges, different learning opportunities, and different chances to prove yourself capable of handling increased responsibility. What looked like instability to Carmen was actually a carefully planned career progression that would prepare me for increasingly complex leadership roles. During one particularly frustrating conversation, Carmen actually suggested that I should consider leaving the military to come work for her real estate firm. "You're organized, you're good with people, and you could make real money," she said, as if my military salary was somehow fake money. "Plus, you'd be home where your family is. Don't you want to settle down and start building something permanent?" The irony was that I was building something permanent, I was building expertise, leadership skills, and a reputation within an institution that had existed for centuries and would continue long after both Carmen and I were gone. But Carmen could only see permanence in terms of geographic stability and material accumulation. The idea that someone might find meaning and purpose in service to something larger than themselves simply didn't compute within her framework of success. Her well-meaning but misguided advice became a regular feature of our interactions. She'd send me job listings for positions in Riverside Valley, as if I was desperately searching for an escape route from military service. She'd mention young men from our hometown who were doing really well in various civilian careers, with the clear implication that I was missing out on normal relationship opportunities because of my unusual career choice. She'd ask when I was planning to get serious about my future, not realizing that I was already serious about a future that looked nothing like the one she'd mapped out for herself. The most telling incident happened during my 3rd year of service, when I received a commendation for my role in organizing disaster relief efforts after a major earthquake in the Pacific region. It was significant recognition, the kind of award that indicated I was being noticed by senior leadership and marked for increased responsibility. When I called home to share the news, excited about this validation of my hard work and growing expertise, Carmen's response was deflating. "That's nice, Izzy," she said in the same tone she might use to acknowledge a participation trophy. "But when are you going to do something that actually advances your career? You can't get promoted forever in the military, can you? What's your exit strategy?" Exit strategy. As if my entire professional life was just an elaborate plan for eventual escape. As if the work I was doing, the skills I was developing, and the service I was providing to my country were all just marking time until I came to my senses in pursuit of a real career like hers. She genuinely couldn't conceive that military service might be an end in itself, rather than a means to something else. Derek was present for that phone call, and I noticed him wince slightly at Carmen's dismissive response to my achievement. After she hung up, I wondered what their private conversations about me might sound like. Did he try to educate her about the significance of military commendations? Did he explain that what I was doing was actually important work that required real skill and dedication? Or had he learned, like I was learning, that Carmen's worldview was too fixed to accommodate perspectives that challenged her assumptions about success and value? These weren't isolated incidents, they were part of an ongoing pattern that revealed how fundamentally different our understanding of worthwhile work had become. Carmen measured success by visible markers: income, possessions, social status, geographic stability. I measured it by responsibility, competence, service, and the trust that superior officers placed in my judgment. We were using completely different metrics to evaluate the same life, and neither of us could understand how the other had gotten it so wrong. What Carmen didn't realize during those years of gentle condescension and misguided career advice was that I wasn't building a resume, I was building a reputation. And that reputation was about to take me places that would shock everyone who thought they understood what my little military phase actually meant. The escalation of Carmen's dismissiveness reached new heights during my promotion to captain, which coincided with her own professional peak as Riverside Valley's Realtor of the Year for 2 consecutive seasons. The timing was unfortunately perfect for reinforcing her belief that her career trajectory was not only more impressive than mine, but also more legitimate in the eyes of people who mattered. Carmen had always been competitive, but success had sharpened that edge into something more cutting. Her real estate firm had expanded to include 3 other agents working under her. She'd been featured on the cover of the regional business magazine, and she'd just closed the largest residential sale in the county's history. Meanwhile, my promotion to captain came with increased responsibilities but no newspaper coverage, no magazine features, and certainly no recognition from anyone in Riverside Valley who might have impressed Carmen's social circle. The contrast became a constant undercurrent in our family interactions. When I came home on leave wearing my new captain's bars, Carmen congratulated me with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for a child's participation in a school play. "That's wonderful, Izzy. Captain sounds so official. Do you get to boss people around now?" She made it sound like I'd been promoted to shift supervisor at a fast food restaurant, completely missing the significance of commanding a unit responsible for critical supply operations across multiple time zones. Her success had also given her a platform for dispensing advice about career advancement, which she now felt qualified to offer to everyone in the family, including me. During one particularly painful conversation over Christmas dinner, she launched into an unsolicited lecture about the importance of building your brand and networking with the right people and positioning yourself for maximum visibility in your industry. The problem with your job, Izzy, she said while cutting her prime rib with surgical precision, is that nobody knows what you're accomplishing. In real estate, every sale is public record. Every success is documented and measurable. People can see exactly how well you're doing. But with your military thing, who even knows what you do all day? How do you measure success when everything is so secretive? Derek shifted uncomfortably in his seat during this monologue. He knew enough about military operations to understand that much of what I did couldn't be discussed publicly, and that the absence of publicity didn't indicate absence of importance. But Carmen was on a roll, fueled by wine and her own recent professional accolades. I mean, don't get me wrong, she continued, I'm sure you're very good at whatever it is you do. But you're 30 now, Izzy. Don't you think it's time to consider a career that actually goes somewhere? Military people retire early because there's nowhere else to go up, right? What happens when you hit that ceiling? The irony of her concern about my career ceiling was particularly painful because I had just been selected for advanced strategic planning courses that would prepare me for field command positions. These weren't details I could share around the dinner table, but they represented exactly the kind of upward mobility that Carmen insisted didn't exist in military service. I was being groomed for responsibilities that would make her real estate empire look like a neighborhood lemonade stand, but there was no way to explain that without violating operational security protocols. Her misconceptions about military advancement were matched only by her misunderstanding of military compensation. Carmen had somehow gotten the idea that military salaries were barely above minimum wage, and she frequently made comments about how I must be struggling financially. You know, if you ever need help making ends meet, Derek and I are doing really well right now, she'd say with the kind of patronizing generosity that made my teeth ache. The truth was that between my base salary, housing allowances, hazard pay, and various other benefits, my total compensation package was quite respectable. More importantly, I had no mortgage, no car payments, no student loans, and minimal living expenses, which meant I was actually saving more money than most civilians my age. But Carmen couldn't see past the posted base salary figures she'd found online, and she'd apparently appointed herself as my financial advisor based on her own real estate income. This pattern of casual condescension extended beyond career advice into every aspect of my life choices. When I mentioned that I was dating someone, a fellow officer stationed at the same base, Carmen immediately began interrogating me about his long-term potential and his exit strategy from military service. She couldn't conceive of a relationship between two military professionals that might actually be enhanced by shared understanding of the demands and rewards of service life. But what happens when you both want to start a family? She pressed during one phone conversation. You can't both be gallivanting around the world playing soldier when you have children to think about. One of you is going to have to get a real job and settle down somewhere permanent. The assumption that military families couldn't successfully raise children was particularly offensive, given that I'd grown up knowing dozens of military children who were well-adjusted, well-educated, and proud of their parents' service. But Carmen's worldview couldn't accommodate the possibility that different family structures might work for different people. In her mind, success meant geographic stability, traditional gender roles, and conventional career paths that fit neatly into suburban expectations. Her dismissiveness reached its peak during a family reunion where several of our cousins were present. Carmen spent most of the afternoon regaling everyone with stories about her latest real estate conquests, complete with detailed descriptions of sale prices, commission rates, and client testimonials. When the conversation finally turned to my work, she introduced my latest assignment with, Izzy's still doing her military thing. We keep hoping she'll grow out of it and come home to do something more practical, but you know how stubborn she's always been. The laughter that followed wasn't malicious, but it was dismissive in a way that cut deeper than outright hostility would have. These were people who loved me, but they'd been trained by Carmen's constant commentary to see my career as an extended phase of youthful rebellion rather than a serious professional commitment. They meant well, but their well-meaning amusement at my stubbornness revealed how completely Carmen had shaped the family narrative about my life choices. Derek's discomfort during these conversations was becoming more obvious over time. I caught him watching me during Carmen's monologues with an expression that suggested he was beginning to recognize the gap between his wife's perception of military service and the reality of what military professionals actually accomplished. But he was in an impossible position. Contradicting Carmen's assessment of my career would require explaining things about military structure and advancement that might reveal more about his own service experience than he was comfortable sharing in family settings. The most painful aspect of this period wasn't Carmen's individual comments, but the cumulative effect of years of casual dismissal. Every conversation that minimized my achievements, every suggestion that I was wasting my potential, every assumption that I was marking time until I came to my senses, they all added up to a sustained campaign of undermining that was slowly eroding my confidence in my own choices. I began second-guessing myself in ways that were professionally dangerous. During strategic planning sessions, I'd find myself wondering if Carmen was right about military careers hitting artificial ceilings. During particularly challenging assignments, I'd think about her comments regarding work-life balance and whether I was sacrificing too much for a career that my own family couldn't respect or understand. The gaslighting was so subtle and so consistent that I almost didn't recognize it as gaslighting. Carmen wasn't intentionally trying to destroy my self-confidence. She genuinely believed she was helping me see reality more clearly. But the effect was the same, systematic undermining of my professional identity by someone whose opinion mattered to me precisely because she was family. What Carmen didn't understand during those years of gentle but persistent disparagement was that she wasn't just critiquing my career choices, she was critiquing my character, my judgment, and my understanding of what constituted meaningful work. And what she definitely didn't understand was that while she was building her reputation in Riverside Valley real estate, I was building something much larger and much more significant in arenas she couldn't even imagine. The stage was being set for a reckoning that would reveal just how wrong her assumptions had been. The psychological toll of Carmen's constant undermining began manifesting in ways I didn't immediately recognize as connected to our family dynamics. It started subtly during my 4th year of service, when I found myself hesitating before speaking up in strategic planning meetings, something that had never been a problem for me before. I'd catch myself wondering if my ideas were actually valuable or if I was just another stubborn soldier who didn't understand how the real world worked, as Carmen so frequently implied. Sleep became elusive during this period, not because of operational stress, which I'd learned to manage effectively, but because of a persistent internal dialogue that replayed Carmen's dismissive comments on an endless loop. Her voice had somehow infiltrated my subconscious, whispering doubts about my life choices during those vulnerable hours between wakefulness and rest. "You're 32 now, Izzy. When are you going to get serious about your future?" The words would echo through my mind at 3 in the morning, making me question decisions I'd been confident about just hours earlier. My performance reviews remained exemplary, but I noticed changes in my interaction style that concerned me. Where I had once been decisive and confident in my recommendations, I began hedging my statements with unnecessary qualifiers. Instead of saying, "We should implement this logistics protocol immediately," I found myself saying things like, "This might be worth considering if it seems appropriate to senior leadership." My commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Blackwood, noticed the change during one particularly important briefing. "Captain Rodriguez," she said after dismissing the other officers, "your tactical recommendations were sound as always, but your presentation lacked the conviction I've come to expect from you. Is there something affecting your confidence in your professional judgment?" I couldn't explain that my sister's constant questioning of my career choices was somehow seeping into my professional identity. How do you tell a superior officer that family dinners were making you doubt your competence? Instead, I deflected with vague references to wanting to ensure my recommendations received proper consideration from all perspectives. Colonel Blackwood studied my face with the kind of penetrating stare that experienced officers develop after years of reading people under pressure. "Captain, confidence isn't arrogance, and humility isn't self-doubt. Don't confuse the two." Her words stayed with me, but they couldn't entirely silence the internal commentary that Carmen had unknowingly installed in my psyche. The erosion of my self-assurance became more pronounced during family phone calls. Carmen's ability to make me feel small had reached an almost artistic level of precision. She'd ask seemingly innocent questions that were actually loaded with assumptions about my life's trajectory. "Are you still enjoying your military work, or are you starting to think about what comes next?" The question presupposed that my current career was temporary, that enjoyment was somehow incompatible with serious professional commitment, and that any reasonable person would naturally be planning an exit strategy. When I tried to explain that I was actually being considered for increasingly significant assignments, Carmen would respond with comments like, "That's nice, honey, but what does that mean in practical terms? Like, will it help you when you're ready to transition to civilian work?" Every achievement became a stepping stone to something else in her framework, never valuable in its own right. The cumulative effect was a gradual disconnection from my own professional identity. I began viewing my accomplishments through Carmen's lens, seeing them as she did, as resume padding for an eventual, real, career rather than as meaningful achievements in their own right. When I received notification that I was being recommended for promotion to major, my first thought wasn't pride or satisfaction. It was wondering whether Carmen would finally see this as legitimate success, or whether she'd find new ways to diminish its significance. My personal relationships began suffering as well. The officer I'd been dating, Captain James Mitchell, noticed that I'd become unusually sensitive to any perceived criticism of military life or culture. During a casual conversation about post-service career possibilities, I'd become defensive and argumentative, interpreting his innocent speculation about future opportunities as evidence that he, too, saw our current work as temporary and somehow insufficient. "Isabella, what's wrong with you lately?" he asked after one particularly intense argument about nothing in particular. "You're acting like everyone is attacking your career choices, but nobody's doing that. We're all in the same boat here. We're all military professionals who chose this life because we believe in it. Why are you so angry all the time?" His question forced me to confront the reality that I'd internalized Carmen's criticism to the point where I was projecting it onto people who had never expressed anything but respect for my choices. I was so accustomed to defending myself against her subtle attacks that I'd begun seeing attacks where none existed. The most devastating moment came during a video call with my parents, when Carmen happened to be visiting their house. She'd recently received another professional award, top producer, for her region, and was explaining her latest business expansion plans when the conversation turned to me. I had just been selected for a highly competitive advanced training program that would prepare me for battalion-level command responsibilities, but I found myself struggling to explain why this was significant. "It's a leadership development program," I said, hearing the uncertainty in my own voice. It's considered a really good opportunity for career advancement." Carmen's response was swift and devastating in its casual cruelty. "Well, I'm sure it's very impressive within your little world, Izzy. But honestly, at some point, don't you think you should consider what all this training is actually preparing you for? I mean, what's the end game here? You can't be a soldier forever." The phrase, "your little world," hit me like a physical blow. In Carmen's mind, the United States military, an institution that protected the freedom and security of millions of people, was a little world. My work coordinating logistics for operations that spanned multiple continents was happening in a little world. The responsibilities that kept me awake at night because other people's lives depended on my decisions were all contained within a little world that somehow didn't count in the larger scheme of things. I ended the call shortly after that comment, claiming I had duty obligations, but I actually spent the next several hours sitting in my quarters questioning everything I thought I knew about my own life. Carmen's dismissive attitude had finally penetrated so deeply that I was seeing my career through her eyes, as an elaborate form of playing dress-up that I'd somehow convinced myself was important work. My commanding officer noticed the change in my demeanor during our next one-on-one meeting. "Captain Rodriguez, I've been watching your performance over the past several months, and while your work quality remains exceptional, you seem to have lost some of the fire that made you such an effective leader. Talk to me about what's going on." For the first time in my military career, I almost broke down during a professional conversation. The weight of constantly justifying my life choices to someone who refused to understand them, combined with the exhaustion of maintaining professional competence while battling internal doubt, had finally caught up with me. I managed to maintain my composure, but Colonel Blackwood wasn't fooled. "Captain, whatever is affecting your confidence, you need to address it. You're being considered for responsibilities that will require absolute certainty in your own judgment. Self-doubt isn't a luxury you can afford when other people's lives are on the line." Her words were the wake-up call I needed, but they also revealed how far I'd fallen from the confident officer I'd been just 2 years earlier. Carmen's systematic undermining had achieved something that combat stress, sleep deprivation, and intense professional pressure had never accomplished. It had made me question my own competence and judgment. What I didn't realize at the time was that this period of self-doubt was actually the darkness before dawn. Because while Carmen was busy building her real estate empire in Riverside Valley, I was being prepared for responsibilities that would soon put her casual dismissal of my little world into shocking perspective. The irony was that her attempts to diminish my achievements were happening precisely when those achievements were about to become undeniable, even to someone as determined to misunderstand them as my own sister. The breaking point arrived on a sweltering August afternoon during what was supposed to be a celebration of Carmen's latest triumph. She had just been named regional director for her real estate firm's entire northern division, a promotion that came with a corner office, a company car, and the kind of salary that would let her move to the exclusive Willowbrook Estates neighborhood she'd been coveting for years. Our parents had driven up from Riverside Valley to take both of us out to dinner at Chez Laurent, the most expensive restaurant in the state capital, where I was stationed between assignments. I should have known something was wrong when Carmen insisted on choosing the restaurant. She'd specifically requested somewhere impressive, where we could celebrate properly, but I realized later that she'd selected a venue where she could showcase her newfound financial status while highlighting the contrast with my military salary. The restaurant was the kind of place where entrees started at $60 and the wine list required a small mortgage to navigate, somewhere designed to make anyone without serious disposable income feel uncomfortable and out of place. Carmen arrived wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly base pay, carrying a handbag that she made sure everyone noticed was new from the boutique in the financial district. She spent the first 20 minutes of dinner describing her promotion in exhaustive detail, the size of her new office, the prestige of her new title, the impressive growth targets she'd be managing. Our parents listened with the kind of pride that comes from watching their child succeed in ways they could easily understand and measure. When the conversation finally turned to me, I had news of my own that I'd been excited to share. After months of intensive evaluation and competition, I'd been selected for Operation Highland Thunder, a joint forces training exercise that would simulate complex humanitarian aid distribution under combat conditions. The exercise involved coordination between multiple military branches, international allies, and civilian aid organizations. It was exactly the kind of high-profile assignment that indicated I was being considered for major command responsibilities. But as I tried to explain the significance of this selection, I watched Carmen's expression shift from polite attention to barely concealed impatience. She kept glancing at her phone, checking her reflection in her knife, and making small sounds that indicated she was waiting for me to finish so she could redirect the conversation back to more interesting topics. When I mentioned that the exercise would involve working directly with senior military leadership from 3 different countries, she actually rolled her eyes. "That sounds very complicated," she said with the tone people use when they're trying to be polite about something they consider boring. "But honestly, Izzy, don't you think it's time you started thinking about your exit strategy from all this? I mean, you're 32 now. You can't keep playing soldier forever." The phrase, playing soldier, landed like a slap across the face. After everything I'd accomplished, after years of increasing responsibility and recognition from senior leadership, Carmen still saw my career as an elaborate game that I was too stubborn to outgrow. But what made it worse was the setting. She'd chosen to deliver this dismissal in front of our parents, at an expensive restaurant, surrounded by the material evidence of her own success. I took a deep breath and tried one more time to help her understand. "Carmen, this isn't playing anything. I'm responsible for logistics coordination that directly impacts mission success and potentially saves lives. The assignment I just described represents recognition for competence in one of the most challenging fields in military operations. This is serious professional work that requires." She cut me off with a wave of her manicured hand. "Oh, Izzy, I know you think what you're doing is important. And maybe it is important, within that world. But let's be realistic here. You're smart, you're organized. You could be running a real business by now instead of taking orders from other people and moving around every few years like some kind of nomad." The word realistic was the final straw. Carmen had just dismissed over a decade of military service, multiple commendations, increasing levels of responsibility, and recognition from senior leadership as unrealistic career planning. She'd reduced my professional achievements to taking orders and characterized my geographic mobility as aimless wandering. But most devastatingly, she'd done it in front of our parents while wearing a dress that cost more than most people made in a week, using her material success to underscore her authority to judge my life choices. You want me to be realistic? I said, my voice quieter than I'd intended but carrying an edge that made everyone at the table suddenly pay attention. Let me tell you what's realistic, Carmen. It's realistic that while you've been selling houses in Minnesota, I've been coordinating supply operations for missions that you'll never read about in the newspapers because they're classified at levels you don't even know exist. Carmen's eyebrows rose in what she probably thought was amused tolerance. Okay, but what does that actually mean in practical terms? Like, what's your endgame here? You can't get promoted forever in the military, and when you finally decide to get a real job, what transferable skills do you actually have? The question revealed everything wrong with her understanding of my career. She genuinely believed that military leadership experience wouldn't translate to civilian management roles, that logistics coordination under combat conditions wouldn't prepare me for supply chain management in the business world, that strategic planning for multi-million-dollar operations wouldn't qualify me for executive positions. In her framework, only experience gained in traditional corporate environments counted as real, professional development. Our father, who had been listening to this exchange with growing discomfort, finally intervened. Carmen, honey, maybe we should. But Carmen wasn't finished. She'd apparently been saving up her concerns about my career choices for months, and she was determined to deliver them all at once in this setting where she felt most confident and powerful. Dad, somebody needs to say this. Izzy is wasting her potential. She's brilliant, she's capable. She could be making real money and building a real life instead of playing dress-up in uniform and pretending that following orders is the same thing as leadership. She turned back to me with what she probably thought was compassionate concern. I'm not trying to hurt your feelings, Izzy. I'm trying to help you see that there's a whole world of opportunities out there that you're missing because you're so invested in this military fantasy. Military fantasy. She just characterized my entire adult professional life as a fantasy. Every mission I'd completed, every crisis I'd managed, every life I'd potentially helped save through effective logistics coordination, all of it was fantasy in Carmen's worldview. The only reality she could acknowledge was the kind that came with visible wealth, social status, and the approval of people like her country club friends. I looked across the table at my sister, really looked at her for maybe the first time in years. She was sitting there in her expensive dress, surrounded by the markers of success that our community valued, absolutely convinced that she was qualified to judge a career she'd never bothered to understand. She'd never asked about my actual responsibilities, never inquired about my accomplishments beyond the superficial level, never shown any curiosity about what military service actually involved in the modern era. You're right, Carmen, I said finally, my voice calm in a way that surprised everyone at the table. This is about being realistic. And the reality is that you have no idea what you're talking about. The silence that followed was deafening. Carmen's confident expression faltered for the first time all evening, not because she was hurt by my response, but because she was genuinely shocked that I'd contradicted her assessment so directly. She was so accustomed to my defensive explanations and attempts to justify my choices that my simple, direct rejection of her authority to judge my life caught her completely off guard. Excuse me, she said, her voice rising slightly. You heard me. You have no idea what my career actually involves, what I've actually accomplished, or what opportunities actually exist for military professionals in the civilian world. You've been giving me advice about a profession you don't understand based on assumptions you've never bothered to verify. Carmen's face flushed red, but whether from anger or embarrassment was impossible to determine. She'd expected me to defend myself against her criticism, not to challenge her qualifications to offer it in the first place. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that her timing for this confrontation was about to prove spectacularly unfortunate. Because the assignment I'd just been selected for wasn't just another training exercise, it was preparation for something that would soon make her casual dismissal of my little world look not just wrong, but absurdly, embarrassingly wrong. The seeds of her humiliation had already been planted. They just hadn't sprouted yet. The moment I challenged Carmen's authority to judge my career, something fundamental shifted in our family dynamic. The comfortable assumption that she was the successful sister dispensing wisdom to the confused sister suddenly became questionable, and Carmen didn't handle that uncertainty well. Her face cycled through several expressions: surprise, indignation, and finally a cold anger that I'd rarely seen from her before. "I don't understand what," she said, her voice taking on the sharp edge she usually reserved for difficult real estate clients. "I'm trying to help you, Isabella. I'm trying to help you see that you're limiting yourself to a world that doesn't offer real advancement opportunities. But if you want to waste your potential because you're too proud to admit you made a mistake, that's your choice." The word mistake hung in the air like a challenge. For years, Carmen had couched her criticism in terms of concern and sisterly advice, but now her true feelings were emerging. She genuinely believed that my entire adult life represented one long, stubborn mistake that I was too proud to acknowledge. In her mind, she wasn't offering guidance, she was staging an intervention for someone who had lost their way and refused to accept help. Our parents exchanged uncomfortable glances across the table. They had watched this dynamic play out for years, usually letting Carmen's comments slide in the interest of family harmony. But my direct confrontation had changed the tone of the conversation in ways that made their usual peacekeeping strategies inadequate. "Maybe we should talk about something else," our mother suggested gently. "This is supposed to be a celebration dinner for both of you." But Carmen wasn't ready to let it go. My challenge to her authority had triggered something deeper than career disagreement. It had threatened her entire understanding of our relationship and her role as the older, wiser, more successful sister who knew better. "No, Mom, this is important. Izzy needs to hear this, even if she doesn't want to." Carmen turned back to me with the kind of determined expression she usually wore when negotiating difficult real estate deals. "You think I don't understand your career? I understand it perfectly. You take orders from other people, you move wherever they tell you to move, you work for a paycheck that's set by government bureaucrats, and you convince yourself that following instructions is the same thing as leadership." Each word was carefully chosen to diminish and belittle. Carmen had distilled military service down to its most reductive elements, stripping away everything that made it meaningful or challenging. In her version, I was essentially a highly educated grunt with delusions of importance, too stubborn to recognize that real success required entrepreneurial thinking and financial independence. "And the worst part," she continued, gaining momentum, "is that you're so invested in proving that you didn't waste the last 10 years that you can't see the opportunities you're missing. Derek and I have talked about this." The mention of Derek's name was a tactical error that revealed more than Carmen probably intended. She and her husband had been discussing my career behind my back, analyzing my choices and finding them wanting. The image of them sitting in their expensive house, evaluating my life decisions over wine and concluding that I was too stubborn to accept good advice, was more painful than any direct insult could have been. But the mention of Derek also reminded me of something important. Unlike Carmen, he had actually served in the military. He understood the structure, the responsibilities, the advancement opportunities, and the translation of military experience to civilian leadership roles. If he was participating in conversations that dismissed my career as misguided, he was doing so despite knowing better, which made his complicity even more troubling. "Derek agrees with you that my career is a waste of time?" I asked quietly. Carmen hesitated for just a moment, perhaps recognizing that she'd revealed something she hadn't intended to share. But she was too committed to her position to back down now. "Derek thinks you're very dedicated and hardworking," she said carefully, "but he also thinks you could apply those same qualities to something with better long-term prospects. He's concerned about your future too, Izzy. We both are." The patronizing tone of her concern was infuriating, but what bothered me more was the casual way she'd co-opted Derek's opinion to support her position. Whether or not Derek actually shared her views, Carmen was using his military background to lend credibility to her criticism while simultaneously dismissing the value of the experience that supposedly qualified him to judge my choices. I looked around the restaurant, taking in the expensive decor, the well-dressed clientele, and the general atmosphere of material success that Carmen had chosen as the backdrop for this conversation. She'd orchestrated this entire evening to highlight the contrast between her financial achievement and what she perceived as my lack of practical progress. The setting was meant to underscore her authority to offer guidance about success and realistic life planning. "You know what, Carmen?" I said, my voice steady but carrying a finality that made everyone at the table lean forward slightly. "You're absolutely right about one thing. This conversation is about being realistic. Carmen's expression brightened slightly, perhaps thinking that I was finally ready to acknowledge her superior wisdom about career planning and life choices. It's realistic to acknowledge that you've built an impressive business and achieved the kind of financial success that our community respects and admires. I paused, watching her nod in agreement. It's also realistic to acknowledge that your success has given you confidence in your ability to evaluate and advise others about their career choices. Carmen was smiling now, clearly believing that I was finally seeing reason and preparing to accept her guidance about my misguided career path. But here's what's also realistic, I continued, my voice taking on a different quality that made our parents sit up straighter. It's realistic to acknowledge that your expertise in real estate sales, however impressive, doesn't qualify you to evaluate military careers, strategic planning, logistics coordination, or leadership development in high-stakes environments. Carmen's smile faltered as she realized that my apparent capitulation was actually leading somewhere else entirely. It's realistic to acknowledge that your financial success, while admirable, doesn't give you insight into career satisfaction, professional fulfillment, or the value of service to something larger than personal profit. I leaned forward slightly, maintaining eye contact. And it's realistic to acknowledge that your assumptions about military service are based on ignorance, not expertise. The word ignorance hit Carmen like a physical blow. She'd spent the entire evening positioning herself as the knowledgeable older sister offering hard truths to a deluded younger sibling. To have that dynamic reversed, to be characterized as ignorant rather than wise, was clearly more than she'd prepared for. "How dare you," she started, her voice rising. "I dare because I'm done pretending that your opinions about my career deserve respect when they're based on willful misunderstanding." I kept my voice calm, but there was steel in it now that hadn't been there before. I'm done defending choices that don't need defending to someone who's never bothered to understand what those choices actually involve. Carmen's face was flushed now, and her hands were trembling slightly as she reached for her wine glass. She'd come to this dinner expecting to deliver a devastating critique of my life choices from a position of unassailable authority. Instead, she found herself being challenged by someone who was no longer willing to accept her judgment as valid. "Fine," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Stay in your little military bubble if that's what makes you happy. But don't come crying to me in 10 years when you realize you've wasted your entire life following orders instead of making something of yourself." The phrase, "little military bubble," was meant to be her final word on the subject, a dismissive characterization that would put me back in my place and restore the proper hierarchy between the successful sister and the deluded one. What Carmen didn't realize was that she'd just set herself up for a fall that would make this dinner conversation look like gentle disagreement. Because my little military bubble was about to expand in ways that would shock everyone at that table, including me. And when it did, Carmen's confident dismissal of my career would become the most embarrassing misjudgment of her entire life. But that revelation was still months away. For now, I simply stood up from the table, placed my napkin beside my barely touched dinner, and said quietly, "I think I'll skip dessert." As I walked away from that table, leaving behind the expensive restaurant and Carmen's expensive judgment, I had no idea that I was walking toward the most significant assignment of my military career. An assignment that would soon make her words echo in ways she never could have imagined. The aftermath of that disastrous dinner hung over me like a storm cloud for weeks. I returned to my base quarters that night feeling emotionally drained and professionally uncertain in ways that reminded me of my worst moments during Carmen's systematic undermining campaign. The drive back to Fort McKenzie gave me too much time to replay every word of our confrontation, analyzing whether I'd been too harsh, too defensive, or simply too honest for our family's comfort. Sleep eluded me that first night back. I lay in my narrow military-issued bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering if Carmen might actually be right about some things. Maybe I was living in a bubble. Maybe my career really didn't offer the kind of long-term security and advancement that civilian positions provided. Maybe my fierce defense of military service was just stubborn pride masquerading as professional conviction. The self-doubt was familiar and unwelcome. I'd worked so hard to overcome the confidence erosion that Carmen's constant criticism had caused, only to find myself right back in that dark mental space after one particularly brutal conversation. The worst part was that she delivered her most devastating critiques in front of our parents, using the setting and her obvious material success to underscore her authority to judge my life choices. My first week back on base was professionally challenging in ways that had nothing to do with my actual duties. I found myself second-guessing decisions that should have been routine, wondering if my defensive response to Carmen indicated some deeper insecurity about my career path. During briefings, I caught myself analyzing my colleagues' behavior, looking for signs that they, too, might secretly question the long-term viability of military careers. Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood noticed my distraction during a routine logistics planning session. My presentation was technically sound, but I could tell from her expression that my delivery lacked the confidence and authority she expected from a senior captain. After dismissing the other officers, she asked me to remain behind for what I knew would be an uncomfortable conversation. "Captain Rodriguez, your tactical analysis was thorough as always, but you seem distracted. Is everything all right?" Her tone was professionally neutral, but I could hear genuine concern underneath the formal language. I wanted to explain about the family dinner, about Carmen's systematic dismantling of my career choices, about the way her confidence in her own success had made me question everything I thought I knew about professional fulfillment. "But how do you tell your commanding officer that your sister's real estate success is making you doubt your fitness for military leadership?" "I'm fine, Colonel. Just working through some personal issues that won't affect my performance." It was the kind of non-answer that military professionals learn to give when they need time to sort through problems without appearing professionally compromised. Colonel Blackwood studied my face with the penetrating stare that senior officers develop after years of reading people under stress. "Captain, personal issues that affect your confidence do affect your performance, whether you recognize it or not. And right now, you're presenting like someone who's questioning their own judgment." Her observation was uncomfortably accurate. Carmen's criticism had indeed made me question my judgment, not just about career choices but about my ability to evaluate situations and make sound decisions. If I'd been wrong about the value and prospects of military service, what else might I be wrong about? "Permission to speak freely, Colonel?" "Granted. My family doesn't understand my career choices. They see military service as limiting. And lately, I've been wondering if their outside perspective might reveal blind spots that I can't see from inside the institution." The words felt like betrayal as I spoke them, but they also felt like honesty. Colonel Blackwood leaned back in her chair, her expression softening slightly. "Captain, every military professional deals with civilian family members who don't understand what we do or why we do it. The question isn't whether your family understands your career, the question is whether you understand it." Her words were meant to be reassuring, but they actually highlighted the core of my problem. Carmen's confidence in her assessment of my life had been so absolute, delivered with such authority, that it had contaminated my own understanding of my professional identity. I was no longer certain that I understood my career any better than she did. The weeks following our confrontation passed in a haze of professional competence masking personal turmoil. I completed my assignments efficiently, maintained my fitness standards, and participated in training exercises with my usual attention to detail. But internally, I was conducting a constant audit of my choices, measuring my military achievements against Carmen's civilian success and finding my own accomplishments somehow lacking. Phone calls home became exercises in careful navigation. Our parents were clearly uncomfortable with the lingering tension between Carmen and me, but they didn't know how to address it without taking sides. My mother would ask gentle questions about how I was doing, her tone carrying the weight of unspoken concern about both her daughter's happiness. My father, with his own brief military experience, seemed more understanding of my career path, but he was also trying to maintain family harmony. Carmen and I didn't speak directly for almost 2 months after the dinner. When we finally did, it was through a carefully neutral text exchange coordinated by our mother for our father's upcoming birthday celebration. The messages were polite and functional, but they carried the chill of unresolved conflict. Carmen had apparently decided that my defensive response to her career advice proved her point about my stubborn refusal to face reality. The isolation was profound and unexpected. I'd always known that my career path was different from my family's expectations, but I'd never fully realized how much I'd relied on their approval and understanding for my own sense of professional validation. Carmen's systematic dismantling of my achievements had revealed how fragile my confidence actually was beneath the surface competence. Work became my refuge during this period, the one place where my abilities were recognized and valued without qualification. My colleagues respected my expertise, senior officers trusted my judgment, and the missions I supported produced measurable results that didn't require family approval to validate. But even that professional sanctuary felt somehow smaller after Carmen's characterization of military service as a little bubble disconnected from real-world concerns. 3 months after our confrontation, I was sitting in my quarters after a particularly long day of logistics coordination when my secure phone rang with a call that would change everything. The voice on the other end identified himself as Colonel Marcus Hayes from Strategic Operations Command, and he was calling to inform me that I'd been selected for a classified assignment that would require immediate deployment to an overseas location. Captain Rodriguez, your performance evaluations and specialized training have brought you to our attention for Operation Desert Phoenix. This is a joint forces humanitarian mission with strategic implications that I can't discuss over unsecured channels. Are you available for immediate deployment? The question was largely rhetorical. Military personnel don't decline classified assignments from Strategic Operations Command. But as I gave my affirmative response, I felt something shift inside me that had been broken since that dinner at Chez Laurent. This was what Carmen would never understand, the moment when your professional expertise becomes critically important to something larger than personal success, when your years of training and dedication converge into an opportunity to make a difference that can't be measured in commission statements or social media posts. Sir, I'm honored to be selected and ready for immediate deployment, I replied, feeling my professional confidence reassemble itself like a complex machine clicking back into proper alignment. As I hung up the phone and began mentally preparing for whatever Desert Phoenix would entail, I realized that Carmen's timing for questioning my career choices was about to prove spectacularly unfortunate. She'd chosen to deliver her most devastating critique of my professional life just months before I would be called upon to demonstrate exactly why that life mattered in ways she'd never imagined. The assignment details would remain classified, but the recognition it would bring would not. And when that recognition came, Carmen's confident dismissal of my little military bubble would look very different indeed. For now, though, I had packing to do and a mission to prepare for. The personal turmoil of the past few months was about to be replaced by the kind of professional challenge that reminded me why I'd chosen this path in the first place. Operation Desert Phoenix turned out to be everything that Carmen thought military service wasn't: strategic, high stakes, and absolutely critical to international stability. The mission briefing took place in a windowless room at Strategic Operations Command, where I learned that I would be leading a joint logistics team responsible for coordinating humanitarian aid distribution in the aftermath of a devastating earthquake in the fictional nation of Kandahar, while simultaneously ensuring that relief supplies reached civilian populations in contested territories where 3 different militant groups were vying for control. The complexity was staggering. We had to coordinate with the United Nations, the International Red Cross, local government officials, and military units from 4 different countries, all while navigating political tensions that could explode into armed conflict at any moment. My team would be responsible for ensuring that medical supplies, food, water purification equipment, and temporary shelter materials reached earthquake victims in areas where traditional supply routes had been destroyed or compromised by ongoing violence. But the real challenge went beyond logistics. Intelligence reports indicated that at least one of the militant groups was planning to intercept humanitarian supplies for their own use, while another was threatening to attack aid convoys that passed through territory they considered their own. We had to design distribution systems that were efficient enough to reach desperate civilians quickly, but secure enough to prevent supplies from being diverted to armed groups who would use them to strengthen their positions in the ongoing conflict. The first month in country was a baptism by fire that tested every skill I'd developed during my military career. I worked 18-hour days coordinating between international aid organizations who had never worked together before, military commanders who didn't trust each other's operational security, and local officials who were simultaneously grateful for aid and terrified of being seen as collaborating with foreign forces. My team of 12 logistics specialists had to establish secure supply routes through mountain terrain that changed daily as different groups gained or lost control of key passages. We developed innovative distribution methods that used local religious leaders and community elders as neutral intermediaries, ensuring that aid reached civilian populations without appearing to favor any particular faction in the ongoing conflict. The breakthrough came during the 6th week of deployment, when intelligence reports indicated that one of the militant groups was planning a coordinated attack on 3 major aid distribution points simultaneously. Traditional security approaches would have shut down all distribution operations until the threat passed, leaving thousands of earthquake survivors without access to medical supplies and clean water during a critical period. Instead, I proposed a completely different strategy. We would decentralize distribution into dozens of smaller, mobile operations that could move quickly through secure areas while maintaining constant communication with military units providing overwatch. The system required precise coordination between ground teams, air support, intelligence units, and international partners, but it would allow us to continue serving civilian populations even while under threat. The plan required approval from commanding officers in multiple countries, coordination with international aid organizations who had to completely restructure their operations, and real-time tactical adjustments as security conditions changed hourly. For 72 hours, I essentially became the central coordinator for a complex international operation involving thousands of personnel and millions of dollars in aid supplies. When the militant attack came, our distributed system worked exactly as planned. Instead of hitting 3 major targets, the attackers found empty distribution points while our mobile teams continued operations in areas they couldn't reach. We delivered more aid during those 3 days of crisis than we had in the previous 2 weeks, while simultaneously denying the militants the propaganda victory they'd been planning. The success of the operation caught the attention of senior military leadership from multiple countries, as well as international media outlets who had been covering the humanitarian crisis. Within days, my logistics coordination strategy was being studied by military academies and aid organizations around the world as a new model for delivering humanitarian assistance in contested environments. But the personal transformation was even more significant than the professional recognition. Working under that level of pressure, with that much responsibility, reminded me exactly why I had chosen military service in the first place. This wasn't about following orders or limiting my potential. This was about using specialized skills to solve complex problems that directly impacted human survival and international stability. Every day brought new challenges that required immediate decisions with life or death consequences. When a bridge was destroyed by militant sabotage, cutting off access to 3 villages with wounded civilians, I had to coordinate with military engineers and local contractors to establish an alternative supply route within hours. When contaminated water supplies threatened to cause disease outbreaks in refugee camps, I worked with medical teams and water purification specialists to implement emergency treatment protocols that prevented a humanitarian disaster. The work was exhausting, stressful, and absolutely exhilarating in ways that no civilian job could match. I was using every aspect of my military training simultaneously: strategic planning, tactical flexibility, leadership under pressure, and coordination with diverse groups of people who didn't necessarily trust each other but needed to work together for the mission to succeed. My communication home during this period was limited and carefully censored for operational security reasons. I could tell my family that I was deployed on a humanitarian mission, but I couldn't discuss specifics about my role or the challenges we were facing. To Carmen, these restrictions probably confirmed her belief that military work was essentially secretive busywork that couldn't be explained because it wasn't actually important. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Carmen was probably showing houses to wealthy clients and celebrating her latest sales achievements, I was coordinating international relief efforts that were being studied by military strategists and humanitarian organizations around the world. But because of classification requirements, she would never know the difference between my current assignment and the routine logistics work she'd been dismissing for years. 3 months into the deployment, I received notification that I was being recommended for promotion to major, along with several commendations for my role in developing and implementing the distributed aid delivery system. More significantly, I was being considered for assignment to the Pentagon's Strategic Planning Division, where I would help design humanitarian intervention protocols for future international crises. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Dr. Sarah Chen, the international aid coordinator who had initially been skeptical of military involvement in humanitarian operations, approached me during our final week in country with something approaching awe in her voice. "Colonel Rodriguez," she said, using the rank I would soon hold, "I've been coordinating international aid operations for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what you accomplished here. The systems you developed didn't just save lives. They're going to change how we think about humanitarian assistance in conflict zones." For the first time in months, I thought about Carmen's dismissive comments about my little military bubble. Dr. Chen was one of the most respected humanitarian aid coordinators in the world, and she was telling me that my military training had produced innovations that would impact civilian populations across multiple continents for years to come. As my deployment neared its end, I realized that Operation Desert Phoenix had given me something that no amount of family approval could provide: absolute certainty that my career choices were not only valid but vitally important. The confidence that Carmen's criticism had shaken was now unshakable, built on a foundation of demonstrated competence under the most challenging conditions imaginable. What I didn't know yet was that this mission would soon become very public, and that my role in its success would be impossible to dismiss or minimize, even by someone as determined as my sister to misunderstand military service. The stage was being set for a very different kind of family conversation. The recognition came faster and more publicly than anyone had anticipated. 2 weeks after returning from Operation Desert Phoenix, I was sitting in my temporary quarters at Fort McKenzie, catching up on paperwork and adjusting to the strange quiet of stateside duty, when Colonel Blackwood called me into her office with an expression I'd never seen before, something between pride and bewilderment. "Captain Rodriguez," she said, gesturing to a chair across from her desk where several newspapers were spread out, "you might want to sit down for this." The headlines were surreal. "Military innovation saves thousands in Kandahar crisis," dominated the front page of the Washington Herald, while the International Tribune featured a detailed analysis titled, "Revolutionary Aid Distribution Strategy Prevents Humanitarian Disaster." But it was the New York Times article that stopped my breath entirely: "Army Captain's Strategic Genius Reshapes International Relief Operations." The articles contained details about Operation Desert Phoenix that I hadn't expected to see in public media. Apparently, the success of our distributed aid delivery system had been so significant, and its implications for future humanitarian operations so profound, that senior military leadership had made the unprecedented decision to declassify major portions of the mission for public discussion. My name, my photograph, and detailed descriptions of the logistics strategies I developed were now being discussed in major newspapers around the world. "The Pentagon wants you in Washington for a press conference tomorrow," Colonel Blackwood continued, her voice carrying a note of disbelief. "They're announcing new protocols for humanitarian intervention based on your work in Kandahar, and they want you there to answer questions about the operational details." The surreal nature of the situation hit me fully as I read through the articles. Journalists who had covered the earthquake and its aftermath were describing my logistics coordination as brilliant tactical innovation and a paradigm shift in crisis management. Military analysts were comparing the distributed aid delivery system to breakthrough strategic concepts that had changed warfare itself. International aid organizations were announcing plans to incorporate my methods into their standard operating procedures. But what struck me most powerfully was the way the articles described the scope and impact of what we'd accomplished. The distributed delivery system hadn't just prevented the militant groups from seizing humanitarian supplies, it had enabled us to reach 40,000 earthquake survivors who would otherwise have been cut off from aid entirely. The mobile coordination protocols had reduced delivery times by 60% while simultaneously improving security for both aid workers and civilian populations. Reading about my own work in these terms felt strange and validating simultaneously. For years, Carmen had dismissed military service as limiting and unimportant, but here were respected journalists and international experts describing my military training as the foundation for innovations that would impact humanitarian operations worldwide. The little bubble, she'd mocked, had produced strategies that were being studied at universities and implemented by organizations across multiple continents. The Washington press conference was unlike anything I'd experienced in my military career. The Pentagon briefing room was packed with reporters from major news outlets, military correspondents, and representatives from international humanitarian organizations. Senior officers introduced me as the architect of the distributed aid delivery system that prevented catastrophic loss of life during the Kandahar crisis, and suddenly I found myself fielding questions about strategic innovation from journalists who usually covered international affairs. "Captain Rodriguez, military analysts are calling your coordination strategy a revolutionary approach to humanitarian logistics. What inspired you to develop these methods?" The question came from a correspondent for CNN International, and it was being broadcast live to millions of viewers. As I explained the tactical thinking behind our mobile distribution networks, I couldn't help but think about Carmen's confident assertion that military personnel simply follow orders and don't engage in real leadership or strategic planning. Here I was, discussing strategic innovations that I developed under combat conditions, while cameras recorded my words for international broadcast and military experts took notes for future implementation. The media attention continued for weeks. Military Times ran a cover story titled, "The Future of Humanitarian Operations, Lessons from Kandahar." Foreign Affairs published a detailed analysis of how distributed logistics could transform crisis response in contested territories. The Humanitarian Review, the most prestigious journal in international aid work, requested permission to publish my after-action report as their lead article. But the most significant recognition came when the Joint Chiefs of Staff announced that I was being promoted to major and assigned to the Pentagon's Strategic Planning Division, where I would lead a team developing new protocols for military-civilian coordination in humanitarian crises. The promotion ceremony was covered by military media, and the assignment was described in defense publications as one of the most influential positions available to mid-career officers. During this period of unprecedented professional recognition, my family's response was revealing and painful. My parents were clearly proud but also somewhat overwhelmed by the sudden media attention. They'd always supported my career choices, but seeing their daughter discussed in major newspapers and interviewed on television was beyond anything they'd imagined when I first announced my intention to attend West Point. Carmen's reaction was more complex and far more telling. When the first wave of articles appeared, she called me with what sounded like genuine surprise and congratulations. "Izzy, I had no idea your work was so significant. I saw the article in the Times, and it sounds like you accomplished something really important." Her tone carried a note of uncertainty that I'd never heard before. For the first time in our adult relationship, Carmen seemed genuinely unsure about her assessment of my career choices. The authority with which she dismissed military service as limiting and unimportant had been undermined by undeniable evidence that my military training had produced innovations being celebrated by experts around the world. But as the media coverage continued and intensified, Carmen's initial surprise transformed into something more uncomfortable. During a family phone call 2 weeks after the Pentagon press conference, she made a comment that revealed how she was processing this new information about my career. "It's amazing that your military work turned out to be so newsworthy," she said, emphasizing the word newsworthy in a way that suggested she was still trying to fit my achievements into her existing framework of success. "I guess you were lucky that this particular assignment got so much attention." The word lucky was telling. Carmen couldn't acknowledge that my success might be the result of competence, training, and professional expertise rather than fortunate circumstances. To admit that would require recognizing that her years of dismissive comments had been based on fundamental misunderstandings about military service and my capabilities. Derek's response was different and more troubling. When he called to congratulate me on the promotion and Pentagon assignment, his tone carried a weight that suggested he understood the full significance of what I'd accomplished in ways that Carmen couldn't or wouldn't. "Isabella, what you did in Kandahar. I've read the operational summaries, and I understand what that level of coordination requires. That wasn't just good logistics work, that was strategic leadership under conditions that would have broken most people." He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried something that might have been regret. "I want you to know that I never agreed with Carmen's assessment of your career. I should have said something earlier." His admission revealed that the conversations Carmen had referenced during our disastrous dinner, the discussions where she claimed Derek supported her concerns about my career choices, had been misrepresented. Derek had understood all along that military service offered real advancement opportunities and required genuine leadership skills. His failure to correct Carmen's misconceptions during our family conversations had been diplomatic silence, not agreement. As the recognition continued and my new assignment approached, I realized that Carmen's confident dismissal of my little military bubble was about to be tested in the most public and undeniable way possible. Because my bubble was about to expand to include some of the most influential decision-makers in international affairs, and there would be no way for anyone to characterize my work as unimportant or limiting. The stage was set for a confrontation that would finally resolve years of misunderstanding, and Carmen's timing for questioning my career choices was about to prove not just wrong, but spectacularly, publicly wrong in ways that would reshape our family dynamic forever. But first, there would be one more family gathering where her assumptions about my life would collide with reality in the most dramatic way possible. Thanksgiving 2023 arrived with an undercurrent of tension that everyone in our family could feel but no one wanted to acknowledge directly. It had been 8 months since my confrontation with Carmen at Chez Laurent, for months since Operation Desert Phoenix had made international headlines, and 2 months since my promotion to major and assignment to the Pentagon. The media attention had died down, but the fundamental shift in my professional standing remained impossible to ignore, creating an awkward dynamic that none of us quite knew how to navigate. Carmen had insisted on hosting Thanksgiving at her new house in Willowbrook Estates, a sprawling colonial with marble countertops and a dining room large enough to seat 12 comfortably. The house was a monument to her real estate success, decorated with the kind of expensive good taste that appeared in home design magazines. Every surface seemed to whisper about achievement, status, and the rewards that came with making smart career choices in the civilian world. I arrived wearing my dress blues, as had become my tradition for family gatherings. The uniform carried more weight now than it had in previous years. The ribbons on my chest told a story of recent accomplishments that had been validated by international recognition, and the major's oak leaves on my shoulders represented responsibilities that extended far beyond what Carmen had ever imagined possible in military service. But I wasn't wearing the uniform to make a statement. It was simply what I wore to formal family occasions, the same way Carmen wore her designer dresses. Derek opened the door when I arrived, and his greeting was noticeably warmer than it had been at previous family gatherings. "Isabella, congratulations again on the Pentagon assignment. That's really something special." His handshake lingered just a moment longer than necessary, and his eyes carried a respect that hadn't been there before the media coverage of Operation Desert Phoenix. Whatever private conversations he'd had with Carmen about my career, he clearly understood the significance of my recent achievements in ways that his wife was still struggling to process. Carmen's greeting was more complex, enthusiastic but careful, as if she was walking through a conversational minefield. "Izzy, you look wonderful. How are you adjusting to Washington? It must be so different from base life." Her tone was bright and sisterly, but there was something forced about it, a quality that suggested she was working harder than usual to project normalcy. Our parents had arrived earlier and were already settled in the living room, where my father was examining the military memorabilia that Carmen had apparently arranged on the mantelpiece: photographs from my West Point graduation, a framed copy of one of the newspaper articles about Operation Desert Phoenix, and the commendation I'd received for my logistics innovations. The display seemed like an attempt to acknowledge my achievements, but it also felt strangely performative, as if Carmen was trying to demonstrate family pride while still processing her own complicated feelings about my success. Dinner conversation flowed smoothly through the usual topics: our parents' retirement plans, Derek's latest promotion to regional finance manager, Carmen's expansion into commercial real estate, and my adjustment to Pentagon life. Everyone seemed determined to avoid anything that might recreate the tension from our previous confrontation, but the careful politeness was almost more uncomfortable than open conflict would have been. The turning point came during dessert, when Carmen asked what seemed like an innocent question about my work in Washington. "So Izzy, what exactly do you do at the Pentagon? I know it's something with humanitarian planning, but I've never really understood what that means in practical terms." The question was reasonable, but something in her tone suggested that she was still trying to understand how my little military bubble had suddenly become newsworthy. I explained that my team was developing new protocols for military-civilian coordination in crisis situations, based on lessons learned from Operation Desert Phoenix, and that we were working with international organizations to standardize these approaches for future humanitarian interventions. "That sounds very important," Carmen said, nodding thoughtfully. "I have to admit, I never realized that military work involved so much strategy and innovation. I guess I always thought it was more about following procedures than developing new ones." It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement of her previous misconceptions that I was likely to get from Carmen, and it represented genuine growth on her part. But before I could respond appropriately, Derek dropped the conversational bomb that changed everything. "Carmen, you know I served in the military before business school," he said quietly. "I always tried to tell you that military service involved real leadership and strategic thinking, especially at Isabella's level." Carmen turned to look at her husband with confusion. "I thought you said military careers were limited in terms of advancement opportunities. When we talked about Izzy's situation, you agreed that she should consider civilian alternatives." Derek's face went pale as he realized what he'd inadvertently revealed. "Carmen, I never said Isabella's career was limited. I said some military careers can be limiting if people don't pursue the right specializations or advancement opportunities. Isabella's career path was always different. She was clearly marked for senior leadership from the beginning. The silence that followed was deafening. Carmen's eyes moved between Derek and me as she processed the implications of what her husband had just said. All those conversations where she'd claimed that Derek supported her concerns about my career choices had been based on misunderstandings or, more likely, selective hearing that filtered his actual opinions through her own preconceptions. "Wait," Carmen said slowly, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Are you saying that when I told Izzy you were concerned about her career prospects, that wasn't actually your opinion?" Derek looked like a man who had just realized he was standing in the middle of a minefield. "Carmen, I was always careful to say that different career paths work for different people. Isabella's military career was clearly successful by any measure. I thought that was obvious." Carmen's face cycled through several emotions: confusion, embarrassment, and finally a dawning recognition that she had badly misjudged both her husband's opinions and her sister's career trajectory. She looked at me with something approaching horror as she realized the full scope of her miscalculation. "Izzy, when Derek and I talked about your career, I thought he was agreeing with me that military service was limiting. But apparently, he was trying to tell me that I didn't understand what you were accomplishing." The moment stretched between us like a bridge across years of misunderstanding. Carmen's confident dismissal of my career choices had been based not just on her own misconceptions, but on misinterpreted conversations with the one person in our family who actually understood military service. She'd spent years offering advice based on assumptions that were not only wrong but contradicted by someone whose opinion she trusted and respected. "Carmen," I said gently, "the problem was never that you didn't understand military service. The problem was that you were so confident in your misunderstanding that you couldn't hear anything that contradicted it." She nodded slowly, and for the first time in our adult relationship, I saw genuine humility in her expression. "I owe you an apology, Izzy. Not just for being wrong about your career, but for being so dismissive about something I didn't understand. I was so convinced that I knew what success looked like that I couldn't see that you were achieving a different kind of success that was just as valid." Derek reached over and took his wife's hand. "Carmen, Isabella didn't just achieve success. She achieved the kind of recognition that most military professionals never see in their entire careers. What she did in Kandahar is being studied at military academies around the world." Carmen turned to him with tears in her eyes. "Why didn't you just tell me I was wrong?" "Because you weren't asking whether you were wrong," Derek replied quietly. "You were asking me to confirm what you'd already decided. And I thought eventually you'd see for yourself what Isabella was accomplishing." Our parents watched this exchange with expressions of relief and sadness. Relief that their daughters were finally understanding each other, and sadness that it had taken so long for the misunderstandings to be cleared up. My mother reached over and squeezed my hand, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'm proud of both of my daughters," she said softly. "You've both accomplished remarkable things in your own ways. I just wish it hadn't taken so long for us all to recognize that." Carmen looked across the table at me, her successful, beautifully appointed dining room suddenly seeming less important than the relationship she'd nearly damaged through years of well-meaning but misguided criticism. "Izzy, can you forgive me? Not just for being wrong, but for being so arrogant about being wrong?" I smiled at my sister, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. "Carmen, there's nothing to forgive. We both learned something important about listening to each other." As we sat around that Thanksgiving table, surrounded by the evidence of Carmen's material success and the symbols of my military achievements, I realized that we'd finally found our way to mutual respect. Carmen's journey from dismissive older sister to understanding supporter had been painful for both of us, but it had ultimately led to a relationship based on genuine appreciation for each other's choices rather than fear that different paths might somehow invalidate our own. The conversation continued late into the evening, with Carmen asking detailed questions about my work and Derek sharing stories from his own military service that he'd never felt comfortable discussing before. By the time I left their beautiful house that night, I felt like I'd finally gotten my sister back, not the sister who needed to approve of my choices, but the sister who could respect them even when she didn't fully understand them. Sometimes the most important victories aren't won on foreign battlefields or in corporate boardrooms. Sometimes they're won around family dinner tables, where understanding finally replaces judgment, and love learns to express itself through respect rather than control. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.